June 30th, 1943. The dawn light forced its way through smoke that cloaked Vangunu Island's canopy. Steam curled up from the jungle floor as landing craft ground onto the coral shore. Diesel clatter blending with the distant snaps of Japanese artillery answering from the hills. This tiny dot in the Solomons, barely noticeable on most charts, was about to become the site of an event that would change the conduct of war. Lieutenant Commander William Bill McClure waded through knee-deep water, his hands wrapped around a waterproof case that held construction blueprints. At 38, he looked more like a Detroit shop foreman than a naval officer, which made sense. Before the war, he had spent the Depression building bridges and highways. Behind him, 357 men of the 47th Naval Construction Battalion splashed ashore, faces set with grim resolve and a quieter emotion. The steady assurance of men who knew how to move mountains. They were not ordinary sailors. The average age was 37, old enough to be fathers to the teenage Marines who had secured the beach hours earlier, electricians from Chicago, heavy equipment operators from Texas, carpenters from Oregon, tradesmen who had built America's infrastructure and were now given what seemed impossible: to cut a fully operational fighter airfield from jungle and coral in a matter of days. McClure glanced at his watch. 3:15 p.m. The beachhead was held, but Japanese observers in the hills were already radioing coordinates to their commanders. Each hour that passed handed the enemy more time to reinforce and prepare. The Americans urgently needed fighter cover for bombers heading north to strike Japanese strongholds on Bougainville. Without a nearby airstrip, those bombers would fly unescorted into slaughter. Surveying the dense green wall ahead, ancient trees rising some 150 feet into the canopy, roots knotted with coral formations harder than concrete. One question burned in his mind. How do you compress months of work into days while enemy artillery tries to kill you? Neither McClure nor the Japanese officers watching from their mountain perches yet grasped what was about to unfold. They were about to see a tempo of engineering so extreme that Japanese radio operators would later struggle to convince their superiors their reports were real. Doctrine built on the premise that airstrips took months to build would be shattered in a little over a week. The Seabees were poised to show that American industrial power wasn't confined to home front factories. It could be packed into men and machines and projected anywhere, turning any patch of ground into a launch pad for victory in a time frame that stunned everyone. What followed would leave Japanese commanders asking the same chilling question modern strategists still ponder. How do you fight an enemy capable of turning every captured foothold into an immediate menace? To feel that shock, you have to see the Japanese military mindset of 1943, which relied on one steady assumption: time. When Americans took an island, Japanese planners assumed they had months, maybe half a year, before the terrain could be transformed into an operational air base. That timetable wasn't guesswork. It was learned by experience. High above on Vangunu, Captain Hiroshi Yamamoto of the Japanese 8th Fleet Intelligence Division peered through binoculars as American landing craft disgorged an unusual load. Instead of only troops and supplies, bulldozers, earth-moving gear, and massive generators slid into the surf. Yamamoto knew this kind of work. He had spent 6 months supervising construction of the Japanese strip at nearby Munda using traditional methods. Conscripted laborers hacking jungle by hand, hauling soil in wheelbarrows, smashing coral with sledgehammers. Their approach to building airfields was methodical, almost ceremonial. Surveyors spent weeks mapping the ground. Work gangs cleared trees one by one and burned the debris in controlled fires. Coral and rock were broken by hand, sorted, and shifted along human chains. Slow and labor-intensive? The process was proven. The result was durable airfields meant to stand for decades. Yamamoto transmits his report to Fleet Headquarters. American forces are landing engineering gear. Initial assessments put an operational runway at 4 to 6 months, matching previous patterns. The reply crackles back. Keep watching. Harass them with artillery when you can. Concentrate on their heavy machines. As the afternoon wears on, the noise coming from the American position feels wrong to him. Instead of steady axe strokes and the snap of burning brush, there's the roar of diesel engines, the sharp concussion of blasting charges, and a piercing whine from powerful industrial rigs. On the beach, McClure's Seabees are doing something the Japanese have never seen. They're bringing industrial production to the battlefield. These men didn't learn their trades in military classrooms. They came from projects like the Hoover Dam, the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and Manhattan's skyscrapers. They think in timelines, throughput, and finishing things immediately. Seaman First Class Tony Rizzo, a demolition specialist who worked on Boston's Big Dig, sizes up the jungle like an engineer rather than an infantryman. Where Japanese construction officers expect months of painstaking clearing, Rizzo does the arithmetic. We need a strip 3,300 feet long and 150 feet across, he tells his crew. Roughly 500 mostly hardwood trees. Properly placed charges at the roots can topple 20 trees at once. He does the math out loud, 6 hours to clear the site. The Japanese have never faced this method because it depends on what their forces lack. Vast quantities of explosives, heavy equipment, and crews trained to use both without constant supervision. Seabees don't sit around waiting for orders. They see obstacles and fix them. When Petty Officer Jim Morrison's bulldozer breaks through a coral ledge and reveals a natural drainage channel, he doesn't file reports and wait. He alters the runway plan on the spot to exploit the find. By nightfall on June 30th, the scene on Vangunu is extraordinary. Portable generators flood the area with light and work continues through the black. Japanese guns try to interrupt the effort, but the Americans simply work around falling shells. Damaged machinery is hauled aside and the crews keep moving. Clogged filters and coral dust are solved with on-the-spot improvisations. Yamamoto radios headquarters again, his voice edged with disbelief. Construction is proceeding at a speed he's never seen, heavy gear running non-stop. He asks for confirmation of the usual airfield timeline. The reply is quick and firm. Stick with current estimates. Americans cannot drastically speed up standard construction methods, but the Americans aren't following standard methods. They've adapted a production line model to combat engineering. As Henry Ford transformed car manufacturing by breaking tasks into repeatable steps, the Seabees have remade airstrip construction. Specialist teams move in sequenced waves. One group blasts and clears with bulldozers, the next grades and levels. Another lays the coral base while a following crew installs drainage, a synchronized industrial operation unlike anything witnessed before. By July the 2nd, only 3 days after the landing, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft bring back a report headquarters initially can't accept. A crude airstrip is already taking form. What had been an impenetrable jungle just 72 hours before was now a widening wound of bleached coral and torn earth. American supply vessels arrived each day, unloading not only raw building materials but prefabricated elements, lengths of steel matting, premixed concrete, even portable fuel systems. The psychological effect on the Japanese observers was crushing. All their strategic planning had assumed months to prepare every new American airbase. Defensive lines were sited with that timetable in mind. Reinforcement timetables were keyed to it, and supply chains were organized around it. Now, watching an impossible tempo of construction unfold below, a terrifying truth began to sink in. If the Americans could assemble airfields this quickly, every captured island instantly became a threat. The Pacific, once Japan's protective moat, was turning into a corridor for American air power. July 3rd, 1943, 0600 hours. The fourth day of what would come to be called the Vangunu miracle. Steam rose from the worksite as the tropical sun burned through the morning mist, revealing something that should not have existed. An almost finished airfield carved from solid jungle in under 96 hours. The noise was overpowering, a roar of diesel motors, pneumatic hammers, and controlled blasts that carried for 5 miles. Lieutenant Commander McClure stood at what would be the runway's midpoint, coral dust dusting his uniform like flour on a baker's apron. Around him, his Seabees worked with the concentrated intensity of men who knew they were part of history. But the radio traffic from Japanese posts told the fuller story. Command, this is Observation Post 3. American airstrip now measures approximately 2,000 feet. Repeat, 2,000 feet. Request verification of timeline estimates? The voice was Captain Yamamoto's, and for the first time in his career, doubt crept into his reports. Headquarters answered sharply and incredulously, impossible. Maintain observation. Provide photographic evidence. What Yamamoto saw through his binoculars contradicted every lesson of his military schooling. The Americans were not merely building an airfield, they were manufacturing one. Like a huge outdoor factory, specialist teams moved in flawless sequence. If a bulldozer struck unexpected rock, demolition experts were already on hand with shaped charges. When coral required compaction, steamrollers appeared. When drainage problems arose, pipe crews deployed prefabricated solutions. Chief Petty Officer Frank "Tank" Thompson, a one-time foreman on the Golden Gate Bridge, watched with professional pride. "Back home in San Francisco," he shouted over the din to a nearby Marine, "we moved 83,000 tons of steel to build that bridge. Here we're shifting 200,000 tons of coral in 1 week. Same engineering principles, different application." The figures were staggering. In 72 hours, the 47th Naval Construction Battalion moved enough soil to fill 15,000 dump trucks. They detonated over 500 precisely placed charges to remove massive trees without wrecking the coral base needed for the runway. And they laid 200 feet of steel matting, each segment locked together like pieces of a huge jigsaw. But it wasn't only the pace that stunned the Japanese. It was the discipline. American construction moved with clockwork precision. When Seaman Rizzo's demolition crew cleared one section, Petty Officer Jake Collins was already poised with his bulldozer to start grading. When Collins finished, Chief Morrison's steel matting team slid in to lay the runway surface. No wasted movement, no waiting for orders, no doubt about who was responsible. Japanese observers had never seen anything like it. Their military ran on a different set of rules: strict hierarchy, exhaustive planning, cautious execution. From afar, the American effort could look chaotic, but up close it revealed a far more dangerous truth. Ordered chaos directed by men who understood both their individual tasks and the larger mission. On July 5th, everything changed. A smoke-trailing F-4U Corsair, limping back from a raid on Bougainville, picked out the pale scar of Vangunu's new strip. The pilot, Lieutenant Bobby Morrison, no relation to the Seabee chief, made a decision that would echo through military history. He tried to land on an airfield that officially didn't exist. Radio traffic crackled. Unknown airstrip. Unknown airstrip. This is Navy 47 requesting emergency landing. Repeat. Requesting immediate emergency landing. McClure snatched the handset, his heart hammering. The runway wasn't finished. The approach still needed final grading. Lights were absent. Fuel systems weren't in place. But a fellow American was in trouble, and that was all the Seabees needed. Navy 47, this is Vangunu Construction Control. Cleared for emergency landing. Runway is operational. Repeat. Runway is operational. What followed felt like slow motion to those watching. The Corsair came in from the south, its engine coughing and sputtering. Seabees scattered from the strip as the fighter descended, lower and lower, until its wheels kissed the coral with a spray of white dust. The plane rolled to a stop roughly 300 yards from the runway's end. Lieutenant Morrison climbed out, kissed the earth, and walked over to McClure with a grin splitting his oil-streaked face. "Sir, I don't know how you built this so fast, but you just saved my life." McClure checked his watch. July 5th, 1943, 14:30 hours, exactly 4 days, 18 hours, and 15 minutes since the first tree fell on Vangunu Island. From his observation post, Captain Yamamoto watched the impossible scene through binoculars that suddenly seemed too heavy. An American fighter had landed on ground that had been impenetrable jungle less than 5 days earlier. With trembling fingers, he keyed his radio. "Command, this is Observation Post 3. American aircraft has successfully landed on the new airstrip. Repeat. Airstrip operationally complete." He paused. the implications settling in. Their timeline estimate was wrong by roughly 5 months. Silence stretched, then headquarters replied, "Provide photographic evidence, prepare a detailed report, request immediate strategic reassessment." The shockwaves were only beginning. Within hours, transport planes brought fuel, ammunition, and maintenance crews. By July 7, the full squadron of Corsairs flew from Vangunu. By July 9th, 9 days after construction began, fighters from the once impossible strip were escorting bombing raids deep into Japanese-held territory. The effect on Japanese morale was devastating. Intercepted radio traffic revealed panic spreading through enemy communications. Enemy engineering output far outstrips every estimate. Existing timetables are no longer valid, and all defensive calculations must be reworked immediately. Staff officers across Japan scrambled to rewrite doctrines that suddenly look as antiquated as cavalry charges. If Americans can convert any seized island into a working airbase in days instead of months, the whole notion of strategic depth in the Pacific evaporates. One intercepted naval transmission decoded weeks later captured the scale of their alarm. Enemy construction methods indicate industrial capacity beyond our understanding. Prior assessments of American capabilities were fundamentally wrong. Recommend immediate strategic reassessment of all Pacific defenses. As July 9th sank toward night, McClure's exhausted Seabees watched American fighters lift off from the strip they had forged. In 9 days, they had accomplished what Japanese planners had called impossible. They proved that U.S. industrial strength wasn't confined to Detroit factories or Norfolk shipyards. It could move ashore with troops and machinery and be turned into combat power anywhere. Most importantly, they had introduced a new instrument to the Pacific campaign, speed itself. Lieutenant Commander Bill McClure never returned to Detroit. 3 months later, he was killed leading his Seabees in another under-fire airfield construction at Bougainville. Still, the legacy of those 9 days on Vanu outlived every man who took part. The immediate psychological blow to Japanese forces was severe. Within weeks, intercepted communications showed a wholesale rewrite of defensive planning. The assumption that captured islands needed months to become operational had been the foundation of their Pacific defense. That foundation had crumbled. Every American landing now represented an instant crisis. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, no relation to the captain who watched Vanu, reportedly told his staff after seeing intelligence on U.S. construction capability, "We are not fighting an army or a navy. We are fighting a whole industrial nation that can reshape the ground itself to meet military needs." The ripple effects went across the Pacific like shockwaves. Buoyed by the Seabees' success, American commanders planned bolder island-hopping moves. Why spend months reducing a fortress when you could bypass it and build forward airfields behind it? In 9 days, the strategic map of the war tilted on its axis around a tiny jungle isle few had heard of. The change in mindset among the Seabees was as profound as the strategic shift. News of the Vanu miracle ran through every naval construction battalion in the theater. Impossible became merely untried. Ontinian Seabees would go on to erect the largest airfield complex in the world. 6 runways able to launch some 500 B-29s in under 2 months at Iwima. They would patch battle-blasted strips in 40 minutes even as Japanese shells fell. The 47th NCB earned a Presidential Unit Citation for Vanu, but the most unexpected badge of honor came from enemy broadcasts. Tokyo Rose called them the devils who move mountains, intending ridicule. The Seabees adopted it proudly. When you see military infrastructure springing up overnight today, airstrips in Afghanistan appearing almost instantly, forward operating bases popping into remote terrain in days, you're watching the descendants of techniques first fielded by McClure's men at Vanu. The U.S. military's knack for rapidly projecting force to any point on the globe can be traced back to those 9 days in 1943, but Vanu's story reaches beyond military annals. It's a tale of American industrial culture applied to combat, a conviction that problems yield to enough ingenuity, grit, and hard work. The Seabees didn't merely build airfields. They introduced a new way of thinking about what was achievable when free people put their skills to a task. Modern historians still teach the Vanu operation as a primer in rapid deployment. Even more pointedly, it proved a lesson authoritarian planners repeatedly undervalue. Individual initiative amplified by technological superiority and industrial scale is a powerful force. The Japanese were rattled not just by the tempo but by the mindset behind it. Their rigid top-down procedures could not match the improvisational resourcefulness of men trained to treat obstacles as puzzles to be solved rather than hindrances to be endured. In 2019, as the U.S. military developed concepts for expeditionary advanced bases in the Pacific, the first historical model cited in planning was the 47th Naval Construction Battalion at Vangunu, 76 years on. The same principles that stunned Japanese commanders continue to influence American doctrine. The jungle has long since swallowed Vanu's coral strip. Vegetation grows up through the steel matting that once sent fighters into the sky. Yet the lesson of those 9 days remains. Speed of execution can be as decisive as sheer force. So when someone says something can't be done, or it will take too long, remember Lieutenant Commander McClure and his 357 Seabees. They showed that impossible is often just a lack of imagination. Sometimes, the gap between victory and defeat isn't measured by who fields the largest army or the most advanced weapons. Sometimes it's who